It's live.
All right. Um, Hello, everyone. I hope you're listening me. And today, we are honored to have Dan Wary to give a lecture to us about animal welfare and especially welfare in dairy cattle. Dan Wary was born in Quebec, Canada, but had the opportunity to live in many parts of the world and until settled down in Vancouver. And in Vancouver, he he found the animal welfare program in the University of British Columbia. He and other colleagues have done many research during the past decades about animal welfare in dairy cattle, but also in laboratory animals and companion animals. And the group there, it's very prolific and very important and have guided many alterations and changings in how we create and livestock production around the world. So, and today I'll leave you the word with Dan. So please, Dan, you can start whatever you want. And I just can see your screen right now. I don't know if it's sharing. If Stella could, okay, it's done. Yeah. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Dan. And now I'll leave you. And at the end, we'll have some time for questions, so everyone can put in on the chat. And those who don't understand very well English, they can activate the subtitles in the YouTube. I hope the subtitles will work well. And and please don't forget to subscribe to our channel in YouTube and also our Instagram, the GEMP, GEMP, Grupo de Medicina da Produção. So now then, thank you very much once more, and I'll let you start.
Thank you very much, Tiago and Stella, for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to be able to meet your group and talk to you about some of our recent research. Yeah, really appreciate the opportunity to do that. And always very nice to talk to a group from Brazil. I'm very proud of the Brazilian connections that we have. We were very lucky to have Tiago visit our group, for example, last year, and very happy to have that collaboration. But I'm going to tell you about our work in a context of Canadian dairy cattle production. And some of our farms here look similar to some of the Brazilian production, but it's also quite different from other parts of Brazilian production. So I'm going to start off telling you a little bit more about about dairy from a Canadian context, and then I'm going to talk about the research we do and try to explain and give examples of some more recent work, as Tiago asked me to do. And this varies from quite practical to more sort of theoretical and experimental. But I look forward to your questions as we go along. And Tiago, tell me if I'm speaking too fast or if there's anything that I'm saying which isn't making sense. Feel free to interrupt me as I go along as well. Okay, well, as I promised, I'd tell you a little bit about sort of the Canadian dairy farmer to start with. This is actually a picture of our own farm at UBC, and our farm looks very similar to the other farms in the region where we have our dairy center. I'm based here in Vancouver, which is right on the ocean, but about 100 kilometers east of here is where most of this province's dairy industry is concentrated. And it's also where we have our own experimental farm. And our farm looks, as I say, like other farms. It's a freestall farm, so the cows are are almost always indoors. Our cows go outside to pasture when they are non-lactating, and some of the heifers go out in the summer as well. But for the most part, they're indoors in this type of a freestall environment. What you can't see from this picture is that the farms, these cows are now also all milked by robotic milkers, so automatic milking system, which again is now becoming very common in our region. Indeed, there's a lot of technology that's used on farms, and one of the approaches that we've taken in our work is basically trying to use that technology better to help farmers make better decisions to care for their animals and ultimately to help improve the welfare of those animals. So I'm actually going to tell you a little bit about that in the first example that I show you. So here is a slide showing some of that technology. This is again our research farm, and what you can see in these blue bins these are called Incentech bins. These are a type of basically a piece of automated equipment. The blue fiberglass component rests on a scale, so there's a constant weight of how much feed is in the bin, and then each of the gates controls whether cows have access, and it also measures which cow is in eating. And so this allows us to determine exactly when cows eat and how much they eat. And in addition to using these bins to monitor the amount that cows eat, we can also use in them to monitor the amount of cows drink. And we've got other technology elsewhere in the farm that allows us to monitor all sorts of other kinds of behaviors. But this is just showing one example of the type of electronic equipment we have. This equipment is not common on Canadian farms, but much of the other equipment that we use is very common. I mentioned earlier that we use these automatic milking systems, which also collect a great deal of data. And I also mentioned that those systems are very common on our farms, partly because of the size of the farms and the way the Canadian dairy industry is structured. The equipment that people put in farms, for example, if a farmer's decision to invest in something like an automatic milking system, or indeed a farmer's decision to invest in other kinds of technology, often those decisions are based around very pragmatic management issues. So, for example, one of the reasons why many of our farmers invest in these automatic milking systems is because labor is very expensive. It's hard to get good quality farm labor in Canada, and of course, dairy farming is hard to do. The cows always need to be milked, and so having some equipment which removes the stress on the farmer, allows the farmers the ability to get away from the farm from time to time, and takes off pressure in terms of trying to find qualified staff is probably the main motivation. However, one of the approaches that we've taken is trying to basically use equipment and the data streams that come from this equipment in novel ways to help us learn more about the experiences of the animals and how we could improve those experiences. And so here's one project which I call Hacking the Drinker. But the idea is simply that what we're doing here is seeing if we can use, as I said here, these blue bins that I showed you in the earlier slide, some of which have feed in them, but some of them which have water. And in this case, what I'm suggesting is that we can hack, we can use the equipment for ways it was not intended to learn things about behavior that are going to be relevant for animal welfare. But before I show you how we do that, let me just show you this video. So you can see there's a cow in there drinking from one of the bins now. Here's another cow that comes up, and boom, she knocks that cow out of the way, and she comes in, she takes her place. Now that's video showing at slow motion, so you can see it very carefully. I can play that for you again as we're chatting. But the idea is that these kinds of events happen all the time, where cows compete with each other basically for valuable resources. And we could measure these kinds of behaviors. If we were there in the farm, we could record them by hand, or we could use video like we've done here to record this interaction. But we can also use some of the equipment we have to pick up these interactions automatically. And in this case, I'm going to show you a project where we did this using the data that comes from these automatic drinkers. So when I go to the next slide, you'll see what I mean. So on this slide, on the x-axis, we have the interval between when one cow entered the drinker and when another cow came and took her space in the drinker. And so you can imagine right over the far right-hand portion of the graph here, where I show interval of 300 seconds. The 300-second interval is 5 minutes. So these points over here on the right-hand part of the graph, what they reflect is one cow leaving the drinker, and then 5 minutes later, we have another cow coming and taking her place. In contrast, look at the far left-hand part of the curve here, where we have a cow leaving, and then immediately, within just 10 seconds or 15 seconds, we have another cow taking her place. And what we did in this project is we simply went through and used the video records that I showed you in the previous slide to see which ones of these intervals are associated with one cow coming and physically contacting another cow and pushing her out of the way. We call those true replacements. And in this graph, they're shown in red. And what you can see is that all of those true replacements, they all happen within these short intervals, within periods where one cow is left and another cow comes in very quickly after her. And that's not surprising, of course. If one cow comes and knocks the other cow out of her way, the reason she's doing that is because she wants to go and drink. And that's reflected in these short intervals then between one cow leaving the drinker and another cow coming in. And in contrast, when we see these long intervals, let's say more than 100 seconds, these are never associated with a true replacement of one cow coming in, hitting the cow, and then taking her place. The difference between the red and the blue distributions of bars then allows us to create an algorithm which can, with high sensitivity and specificity, identify true replacement events simply on the basis of the intervals. And why would we want to do that? Well, the reason, of course, is that these automated equipment, in this case, this drinker, is automatically recording the intervals between cows. And so even though the machine was never intended to be able to tell us anything about the competition between cows, it turns out that by understanding the data, we can now use the data in a new way. And that is to calculate when animals are physically, aggressively competing with each other to take their place. And so if you imagine where those two curves intersect, and we can do that mathematically, we can see if any interval less than about 30 seconds, more precisely 29 seconds, if we see an interval that short, it's of high likelihood that those are going to be associated with true replacements. In contrast, if we have an interval of greater than that period, it's much less likely that that interval is associated with the true replacement. So we can simply apply an algorithm to our data, to our interval data, and use that to identify how often these replacements occur. Why is that important? Well, you can imagine if we were doing this, going through by video to find this would take a tremendous amount of time. It would make it infeasible for farmers to do this. To give you an example of the way we've used this data, let me show you the next graph. So here we have on the x-axis the time in the last 3 days when the THI, the temperature humidity index, was greater than 72. THI of greater than 72 is normally an indicator of when the cows are at risk of heat stress. And on the y-axis, what we have now here is measures of number of replacements. These are data now which we initially would collect using video, but now, in fact, the data from the slide I'm showing you here has all been collected using our algorithm that we collect the data automatically from the drinker. And what you can see is that the replacements, in terms of total number of replacements per day, are quite low when, when the temperature humidity index has been low. But when there has been considerable amounts of time when the THI has been greater than 72, we see many more of these replacements. And so this suggests that this kind of replacement behavior, and that makes sense, of course, because these are cows physically competing to get access to the drinker, that these replacement behaviors might be a real-time indicator of heat stress. And so allow farmers or scientists to better identify when the cows are at real risk of heat stress and intervene in a variety of ways. Very practically, the results also suggest that the cows need better access to drinkers during periods of hot weather. And that's, of course, not going to be surprising to you right now in Minas Gerais, where I'm sure you're experiencing some hot weather right now. Okay, so just a take-home section from this first part of my lecture really today is to say how important the various technologies are on farms and what an opportunity we have in terms of using some of that data in better ways. And this is a big focus of our research right now, where we're trying to use data in better ways to help farmers make good decisions. And sometimes this involves, as I say, hacking a piece of equipment so we can extract data from it that was never intended to be extracted. Okay, in terms of another sort of piece of innovative research that we've been involved in, I'd like to talk a little bit about how our approach has changed, and I think how really there's a need and an opportunity to change the approach of much of the research we do on farms, to instead of considering sort of herd-based interventions, we consider personalized interventions. So where we treat each, in this case, cow, shall we say, as an individual, and try to create methods of caring for those cows that meet the particular requirements of those individuals. This might come as something which sort of sounds strange for people trained, for example, in veterinary medicine, where often we're thinking of using sort of herd-based interventions. But I would argue, and if you think actually in relation to the types of innovations I just showed you in the previous example, we now have great opportunity to follow individuals, partly as a result of this automation. And I think that higher quality data, higher quality individualized data gives us the opportunity to I think, radically change the way we manage animals in a way that's going to be better for the animals and better for the farmers. Now, managing the needs of each individual separately, of course, isn't going to come as a surprise. This is me with one of my undergraduate classes, and you can imagine all of the students in this photo have quite different needs. And if I try to approach my way of teaching or interacting with the students in terms of just treating every student as the same, I'm not going to get very far. And so as a teacher, we learn, of course, to modulate how we do and what we do to meet the needs of our individual students. And we need to do that on farm as well. And we can think of this concept as one of personalized welfare. And so here's a picture. I haven't showed you a picture yet of this facility, but this is a picture of our dairy calf facility. And here's one of our calves drinking from a nipple in a calf pen. And I'll show you more slides of that calf facility in a second. Here's a photograph from the other side. On the right-hand side, you can see group pens, and in each of those group pens, there might be 6 or 8 calves. And what you're mostly seeing here is various bits of equipment that we use to feed and care for those cows, including automatic milk feeders. Those are the de Laval dark blue feeders, and then also those light blue feed bins that I showed you earlier. So those allow us to automatically monitor and control the amount of milk the calf gets, the amount of grain the calf gets, calf starter it gets, also the amount of forage it gets, and also the water. So we're able to monitor intake of all those different nutrients. Here's much of our work in this system has been focused on these dark blue milk feeders, partly because they allow us to do much more controlled feeding of milk than is feasible on most farms, where if there's a large number of calves, it can be very complicated for farmers to be feeding each calf individually and according to its own sort of feeding schedule. But of course, from using a computer, it's very easy to set calves up with different types of feeding programs and to manage those individually. And one of the benefits of this is it allows us to improve our weaning methods. So let me give you an example of why this is important. Here we can see the trajectories of 2 different calves. So these were calves we were monitoring over, in this case, the first 4 weeks of life. So from birth until 28 days of age. Actually, in this case, we're monitoring them all the way to 30 days of age. And that's on the x-axis. On the y-axis is the amount of grain the calves eat. So like all baby calves, in the first few weeks of life, these calves completely rely on their milk. And in our setup, and this is on the basis of research that we've done for many years, we are feeding the calves high quantities of milk. It depends a little bit on the study, but we might be feeding them 8 or 10 or even 12 liters of milk a day. So the calves are getting lots of milk. But over time, the calves still begin to eat grain. And what you can see here is 2 different trajectories. In the red, we see one calf that even at 4 weeks of age has barely started eating any grain at all. And then in the dark blue, we have a calf that's begun to eat much more solid feed. And it turns out that these different feeding trajectories really set the calf up for later success at weaning. So those calves that are able to begin to eat much more solid feed before weaning are then able to wean much more successfully. So they show less of a growth check, and they also show less of an emotional response, less vocalization, for example, when they are weaned. Using this kind of technology then allows us to track the individual behavior, in this case, identify the calves that are eating lots of grain before weaning, and allows us to intervene in specific ways that allow those animals to succeed. One of the approaches that we've been taking is simply to provide those calves which are slow starters in terms of eating that grain intake. We just give them more time to wean, so they're not all in the same weaning trajectory. One of the things that this equipment allows us to do, for example, is set the weaning program up on the basis of the amount of solid feed the animals are consuming. So we're able to wean those animals that start consuming solid feed earlier, we're able to wean them earlier. And in that way, if you think about it, we can save some of the milk from those calves that don't really need it and apply that milk to these other calves that just are taking just a little bit longer to get started on solid feed. Another really important area of research for our group has been to try to understand affective states in animals. And by affective states, I mean emotional experiences that matter to the animals, experiences, for example, like pain. And there's been lots of work in our group on this issue, and I thought I'd share some of this with you because you might be interested in it, both from the perspective of those interested in dairy cattle, just from dairy cattle production, but also the veterinarians in the audience that are interested particularly in pain and preventing and avoiding pain in animals. Okay, I wanted to share in particular just a few sort of more recent approaches that we've been using to understand pain. A lot of work traditionally has looked at sort of acute responses, for example, has looked at whether the animals will show an acute behavioral or physiological response during a procedure. And what we've been trying to do is use work which use more sophisticated tests, which we think allow us to make stronger conclusions about what actually the animals are experiencing. And actually, most importantly, allow us to make conclusions about how important that pain is to the animal. So here's an example of one experiment. This is done by Thomas Eddy, one of our previous PhD students. And what Thomas did is he trained calves to, initially he brought them into this area, which calls the lobby here. And then the gate would open, that gate number 2, and the calf would then be able to walk into the test pen and approach a milk bottle. So these calves are all being fed milk. And, but this is first thing in the morning, and this is the first milk meal of the day for the calves. So the calves are motivated to go get the milk. And so they learn over time that there's milk being provided from the milk bottle, and very quickly the animals learn to just run. As soon as that gate 2 is open, they run in and start drinking the milk. Okay, so far so good. So there the calf runs in and starts drinking the milk. Once the calves are doing this reliably, then what Thomas did is he would allocate the calves randomly to 1 of 4 treatments. And those were either 3 types of injection: intramuscular, subcutaneous, intranasal, or a control procedure, which was just sham, basically, was doing no injection at all. And so now, basically, the calves have learned initially that to come and receive this milk reward, which they love, and they were all running very quickly to get their milk. But they learn now over time that if they're going to come and get their milk, they're also going to be exposed to one of these 4 procedures. And so now the animal has a trade-off. It's the question for each calf is, do I go and get my milk? But if I do, I have to accept this procedure. And we can use this as a way of basically asking the calves, how important is it to you to avoid the pain from these kinds of injections? And the practical aspect, of course, is which of these types of injections do the calves find the most aversive? Which of the procedures is the calf most likely to avoid? To make this experiment even more sensitive, what Thomas did is he would slowly reduce the amount of milk the calf would receive over time. So initially the calf was getting a full liter of milk, and then later just a half a liter, and then a quarter of a liter, and then no milk at all. And this is what the results look like for that experiment. So here is at the beginning of the study, when all the animals have been trained to come for their 1 liter of milk reward. And this is how quickly the animals approach. So approach latency is the amount of time it takes the animal to go from that gate 2 until they start sucking on the bottle. And you can see that all of the animals are going very quickly within just a few seconds. The only group that's starting to show slightly longer times is the animals that are receiving the IM, the intramuscular injection. That's at 1 liter of milk. But when Thomas reduced the amount of milk to half a liter, and then to a quarter liter, and then to no milk at all, we see this big change in the responses. But always what we see is the animals receiving the intramuscular injection are the animals that are most reluctant to come and get their milk. And from this, we can really make 2 different types of conclusion. One is just very practically that if you have the choice, if you have a drug which can be given effectively both through, for example, subcutaneous or intramuscular routes, use the subcutaneous route, because this is much less aversive for the animals. But also more methodologically or theoretically, what this study shows is that by using clever experiments like this one, we can find out basically just how important that pain is to the animals. So one way of looking at these graphs is to say that the animals, that calves are willing to give up access to a very valuable food reward, in this case, a milk meal, if they are receiving certain types of injections like intramuscular, but they'll still go very rapidly to receive their milk reward if they're going to receive a subcutaneous injection. So it's a way of basically asking the animals how much they are willing to pay to avoid getting a painful procedure. So that's one cool, innovative approach that we've used. Here's another approach. I'm illustrating this using this famous quote from Clint Eastwood, where he said, "Do you feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?" And in this case, you can imagine the poor recipient of the Clint Eastwood line is probably not feeling that lucky. But what about feeling lucky in animals? Do you think we can even do this kind of approach? And what I'm about to show you is, yes, there are, again, clever experimental ways that we can get at this, if you would like, level of optimism or pessimism in animals. And we can use that again to try to understand how important or how impactful are painful procedures on these animals. So let me show you how this works. So here's one study where we trained calves to approach a computer monitor that was set up in their pen, and they would learn that when the monitor was red, if they ran up and touched the red monitor, they would get a milk reward. But if the monitor was white, if they went up and touched the animal, they would get no reward at all. And so let me show you what this looks like. So here's the calf. It starts it hits the red screen, and then it goes to the corner and drinks its milk. You can hear it drinking its milk, I hope. And then it's ready to start again. It hits the button, it comes back, no, it's white. Hits it again, still white. Hits it again, still white. Hits it again, no. Hits it again, it's red, and it goes and touches the screen, and then it goes and gets this milk reward. So the calves can learn very quickly to tell the difference between what's a red screen, and the red screen is good, and then a white screen, and a white screen is bad. Then what we do is we make life complicated for the calves by showing them these different ambiguous pink screens, these screens which aren't red and they're not white. And you can imagine a calf that feels lucky when it sees a pink screen will treat it like it's a red screen and will run up and touch it. A calf that feels unlucky will treat the pink screen like a white screen and will stay away from it. And so let me show you what these results look like. So here is the number of screens approached depending upon the color of the screen. And the screens that are colored like the positive and the negative ones, as I showed you, they're always approaching the positive. They're never approaching the negative. And the screens that are a pink that's almost like the positive, well, they go to most of the time. The ones that are halfway, they go to about half the time. The screens that are closer to the color of the negative, they go to less often. This is called the generalization curve, and it's very well known in psychology. And this is like a normal kind of response when you test animals with these sort of ambiguous cues. It's what happens next that's interesting. So now we have these same calves, and we put them through a disbudding procedure where we remove the horn buds. And we have done a very good job of controlling the pain of this procedure. We give the animals a sedative, so the animals are asleep during the procedure. And we give them a lidocaine and nerve block, so the animals are not experiencing intraoperative pain. They're not experiencing pain during the, let's say, hour and a half during the procedure and after the procedure. But the lidocaine only is effective for, let's say, about 60 to 90 minutes. And so in the hours that follow this, the animals do experience postoperative pain. And this is well known. And the point of this study was to see, well, do calves that are experiencing this postoperative pain, do those calves feel unlucky? And so this is the slide showing that effect. So the green line is what I showed you before earlier, which is the before disbudding, but the red line is the after disbudding. And what you can see is, just as we expected, the animals that are in the period after disbudding, when they're experiencing pain, they're showing the response, this more pessimistic response. They're feeling unlucky. They're treating the screens that they used to treat as positive, then are now treating them, they're more likely to treat them as negative. So in other words, calves experiencing pain after disbudding seem to feel less lucky. Okay, now let me show you some other kinds of approaches we can get at these kinds of mood states, these longer lasting affective states, which can be induced by painful experiences. And I think these are particularly important because, again, these help us understand not just what the animals are experiencing in the moment, during the instant when we're causing the pain, but how also these painful experiences can have effects on the animals much longer. And another one of these approaches that we can use is called anhedonia testing. So anhedonia means that animals are no longer taking pleasure in the things that used to give them pleasure. And in this case, we can imagine that a calf sucking on a bottle would be something that would normally give it pleasure. And if the animal's no longer taking pleasure in that, then we consider that as a type of anhedonia. Anhedonia is normally tested in laboratory animals using a sucrose solution, so just using sugar and water. So in this case, this study, we did the same thing. We gave calves this solution of sugar and water, and here you see the calves drinking that sugar water solution, which they drink very readily. They like drinking. And in this study, Benjamin LaCour tested the animals with this sweet solution before disbudding, and then again after disbudding. And this is what he found. So on the y-axis now, we have the change in sucrose consumption from before disbudding to after disbudding. And what you can see is almost all of the calves that were tested drink less sucrose after disbudding. And some calves refuse to drink the sucrose at all. So this is something that they all were drinking before, and now they go to at least some of the calves drinking much less, 50% or less, and some drinking none at all. So this is evidence of anhedonia, and this shows then that the calves in that period, in the hours after disbudding, when they're likely experiencing postoperative pain, are also showing this evidence of reduced mood, of low mood, in this case, as evidenced by no longer taking enjoyment in what they used to enjoy. This study shows one direction of effect, which makes sense, right? When the animals are experiencing pain, we see that they have these negative mood states, which lead to negative expectations. When the animal's experiencing pain, they feel less lucky, right? They're less likely to experience something, to anticipate that something good is going to happen to them. They're less likely to enjoy the sucrose solution. They're less likely to approach the pink screen because they think it is going to be associated with the milk reward. But is it possible that we can switch? We can also this causal arrow goes both ways. In other words, if we have animals that already have negative expectations, might that also change the way the animals experience a painful procedure? And we also are now starting to get good evidence that this might be the case too. And let me show you an example of that type of result. This result comes from basically a more sophisticated way about thinking about what pain means to animals. So often when we think about pain, we just think about a sensory input. For example, in this case, taking the hot iron and putting it on the calf, and that's going to lead to some kind of painful experience for the animal. But more and more in the human literature, we're beginning to understand that, in fact, the experiences of animals are also affected by the expectations that we have around pain. And this is most famously illustrated in the placebo effect, right? If we expect that, let's say, we're given a substance that we're told that this is going to reduce the pain, then many studies have shown that even if all we've been given is something, an inert substance like saline, that we're still likely to judge the pain as being less important. So these kinds of placebo effects can only be explained by the change in expectation, because the sensory input, of course, is the same. And there's now growing evidence that these kinds of expectations are also important to consider when we think about pain in animals. I'll give you an example of that in the next study. So here is really putting together two different types of study that we've done. First of all, looking at the right-hand side, this is a measure of cognitive bias, like I showed you earlier, of that judgment bias, where we show the animals sort of these different types of pink screens, and we rank the animals in terms of how pessimistic they are, where the animals in the far right part of the graph are the more pessimistic animals, and the animals on the far left side of the graph are the more optimistic animals. And what we're showing now in the different colors of points there is how those animals then responded in the anhedonia tests. And what you can see from that is that the animals that were more pessimistic, the animals that were found to be more pessimistic before disbudding, are the animals that show the greatest change in sucrose response after disbudding. In other words, those animals that were already in a low mood state, those animals that were already judging things negatively, also seem to interpret their pain responses more negatively. And this then resulted in a more severe anhedonia response that we see in the left-hand part of the graph. So that's, I think, a really important result. And this is something that our groups become much more interested in now, is understanding not just the immediate experiences of pain, but what is the narrative? What is the animal's experiences leading up to that painful event? And I think this is something that is tremendously important in terms of when we think about how do we control and prevent pain in farming contexts, is understanding and thinking about not just the pain that the animal's experiencing in the moment, but what about the other painful experiences the animals have experienced? And are there ways of avoiding that? Are there ways of setting animals up so they're more likely to expect something positive rather than expect something negative? I'm sorry, it's out of order. Okay, I wanted to just switch gears now. We've talked a lot about negative experiences. I want to talk a little bit about positive experiences. Here, this is a result of a study from Anna Marika Schmidt, where she had our cows that I showed you earlier that are normally housed indoors, and she was looking at the cows when they had access to a period of time outdoors. And in this case, the outdoor area is just an area where there's sand, and you can see these cows running when they come out in the sand. So this play behavior obviously is an example, one type of example of positive affective state. But we've been interested in other types of positive experiences that animals can have inside of our freestall barns. And one example of the types of resource or facility that we can provide animals that may give them positive experiences are these types of mechanical brushes. So this is just a motor hooked up to a brush, and when the cow hits that motor, hits the brush, it turns the motor on, and the brush will rotate, and the calves seem to really enjoy this experience. So the calves will go up and use this many times a day. It turns out to be a valuable resource. And in this one study by McConaughey et al., we tested just how important that brush is to the cows. And the way we did this is as follows. We created the setup where cows could get access to the brush by pushing this gate. The gate was attached to this wire, which was then attached to some weights. And so the cows had to initially just do a little bit of force to open the gate. And over time, we added more and more weights. So the tasks became more and more difficult. So here's a video of what this looks like. So here's a cow comes up, and it pushes the gate open, and then it goes and uses the brush. One very happy cow using that brush. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, if this is important to the cow, just how much weight is she willing to push? And here's a way of quantifying that data. So here we have how much weight the cows are willing to push. That's on the x-axis. And this is the proportion of cows in the group that were willing or able to push that weight. And in the different colors, we have cows pushing for either access to fresh feed. And this is fresh feed after they've been away from milking. And we know the cows are highly motivated to go get that fresh feed after milking, versus access to a brush, which is shown either in the yellow or in the dotted red, versus access to the same space, but with no brush, just empty space. And what you can see is when the cows are pushing a weight to go access just that open area of the pen where there's no brush, so all the cows are willing to push a bit of weight to get in, but as soon as we have even 7 kilograms, far fewer cows are willing to push the weight. And then by the time we get to 23 kilograms, there's hardly any cows at all that are willing to push the weight. In contrast, when we provide access to the brush, we see the cows are willing to push much more weight. Indeed, the cows seem to be willing to push just about as much weight to access a brush as they do to access fresh feed. And we consider this as a type of gold standard. So this allows us to conclude that access to a brush for these cows is actually very important. So the cows seem to enjoy it, and it seems to be a very important resource for them. And this is one reason that we recommend very strongly to our farmers to provide access to a brush if they can in these types of pens in our freestyle barns. So in these examples, I've shown you some of the ways that we've been developing more sophisticated methods to assess affective states, including different types of pain and how this could allow for better recommendations for farmers. And also, I've hinted at some of our new work on positive experiences, such as outdoor access and brush use. I haven't talked to you about cow-calf contact, but I could talk to you more about that during the question period if you're interested. Okay, a final type of innovation that I'd like to talk to you about is our work in collaborating with farmers to improve the kinds of research we do, and ultimately to be thinking of the kinds of changes we do on farms that improve the welfare of animals to be also improvements that improve the welfare of the farmers, to think of farmer welfare and animal welfare happening together. And this fits under this approach of one welfare, which is becoming to be quite a hot topic now in our research area. Just to give you an example of sometimes the limited ways in which we frame this just as scientists, frame the issues just as scientists, here is a word cloud that comes from the literature that my colleague and I, Nina von Kaiserlink, and I reviewed for a special issue of the Journal of Dairy Science, where we looked at research in animal welfare, and we looked at the words used in the abstracts. And here you see some of the most common words. So you can see where basically that literature is going. A lot of it's focused on behavior, some of it's on management. We see words like mastitis, lactation, performance, mortality, disease, pain, as key areas of focus within the scientific literature. And these, of course, much of this work is work that I've been involved in. This is all work which I think is important and that needs to be done. But it's also, I think, important that we're not doing our work in a vacuum. We're not just speaking to other scientists, but we're making sure that the work we're doing is actually meeting the real concerns of the people who are going to use the results. And those, of course, are the dairy farmers. And so here's a different type of word cloud. This comes from some interview work that I was doing with local farmers, where I was asking these farmers about what did they see as things that are very important to have and things that are very important not to have in the farms that need to be in place in the decades to come. So it was all about what are the requirements for our future farms, and how do we identify things that are going to be really important for those farms versus those things that we definitely don't want to have on those farms. And this is, of course, important for researchers, because the work we do as researchers now, those are to benefit farms in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now. So we need to be addressing the needs for those future farms. And you can see here the words that are up on this word cloud are quite different. Things like local, outdoors, organic, farm to table, family run, natural breeding, pasture, freedom, automation. There are also some words there. Oh, tours. That's another one of things which people like to see. Robots, interestingly, things they like to see. There's also some words of things they didn't like to see. Things like tie stalls, which are still common in Canada. Things like manure smell, which many of us think is just part of being around cattle, but that they also saw high levels of manure smell as being something which scared people away from agriculture. And high levels of drug use and antibiotics are also things which they saw as concerns that we needed to be addressing in our research. So I think that gap is a really important one for us to realize, and that we need to be doing work that addresses the concerns of the farmers, not just what addresses the concerns of other researchers. Along that line, we've been doing a bunch of approaches where we're working very closely with farmers, trying to understand what their concerns are and also fine-tune the kinds of research that we do to better help their needs. And one type of research that we've been doing is what we call a benchmarking approach, where we record what those farmers are actually doing, how well the cows and calves on the farms are actually doing, and we give that data back to the farmers to allow them to make decisions. And so here's a study by Atkinson and a partner study by Sumner that we did, where we went on dairy farms and we measured the passive transfer from the colostrum using serum total protein measures, and we gave those measures back to the farmer. And that allowed the farmers to see the successful cases, but that allowed them to also do a better job of identifying cases where they were not successful in ensuring, in preventing failure of passive transfer. And as the farmer who responded to this report said, you start putting the calves with the numbers, and it made sense because they weren't getting enough colostrum. It was nice to have this figured out. What we found is the farmers that actually ended up getting access to these kinds of reports were much more likely to do changes on their farms to address problems. And what we also found, I think, is very important in this case, dairy scientists have been talking about for at least 50 years this issue of failure of passive transfer. It's a remaining problem. And what we found in this study is that each farmer was having different types of problems. So giving the farmers one generic solution wasn't working. What the farmers needed to see is they needed to see their own data to motivate them to do something, and then also to look through to understand which calves were failing, to get a better understanding of what were the management failures that were leading to that problem on their farm. So a real focus from this collaborating with farmers to improve outreach aspect has been in terms of better understanding the farmers' needs for research that I talked about. I've given you an example here of one particular case example we've used, which is using this benchmarking of welfare relevant measures like failure of passive transfer. We've also done other work on lameness to help farmers see how they're doing. We actually also show them how well they're doing relative to peers in their region, so they can see that there are other farms in their region that are doing much better than them, and that can motivate them to show them that there are ways of managing this problem. But also this allows us, it gives us a method for better understanding the farmer's values and constraints. And that allows us then to tailor solutions that work well for those specific animals and those specific farmers. And I think, just like I talked about personalized welfare earlier, when it came to better using equipment, I think this approach of working with individual farmers and coming up with individual solutions for individual farms is very important. So on that note, I'd just like to thank again, Tiago, for the invitation to speak with you. It's a great pleasure to be here today. These slide just shows some of our partners that fund our research. Our research happens in close collaboration with the dairy farmers in Canada. And we couldn't do the research without their support, and we're grateful for it. And I'm also grateful for any questions that you guys might have on the research that I talked to you about, on dairy farming in Canada, on welfare issues in dairy cattle, or anything else you want to talk about. Thanks again for the opportunity to talk to you. I look forward to your questions.
Hey Dan, Stella here. I will start with a question of mine, so I give time to my colleagues to send them in the YouTube. First, I would like to say that I loved your presentation. I think in Brazil especially have a lot to learn about welfare in cattle. And I also want to say that I loved the cow with the hairbrush. I found it very cute.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you about intensified nursing calves. As you mentioned, the calves that start eating grain and solid food earlier, they showed less stress at the weaning phase, right? So, what do you think about that calves that are allowed to drink as much milk as they desire? Do they experience more stress at the weaning phase or something like it?
That's a fantastic question, Stella. And yes, so basically, like everything else in dairy farming, it's complicated, right? And there's all these many parts of calf rearing. What we know in terms of the first phase of calf rearing, and by that I really mean the first 4 weeks, especially, and I said that in the talk. These baby calves, the only way, like other baby mammals, like us, the only way we can grow and thrive, mount an immune response, everything else we need to do as young mammals is by drinking milk. So in those first few weeks of life, we're 100% reliant on milk. So are baby calves. And it's really important, if we want those calves to do well, to feed them lots of milk during that period. Okay. And we know that from all sorts of research. All the indicators of success are better if we feed the calves lots of milk. The problem is, over the past, 30 years in dairy production, we've gotten used to this very easy way of weaning calves. If we want to wean calves, if we want calves to be highly motivated to eat solid food, what do? You don't feed them milk. You feed them very little milk. And so that's what we've done for far too long in dairying, is we just use this as this very simple and ultimately counterproductive approach of not feeding enough milk to get them to wean easily. And yes, if we don't feed milk, then the calves that survive, of course, we know in calf production, there's a very high rates of morbidity and mortality. So we're not, in the dairy industry, we should not be very proud of our success in calf production for the most part. We can do much better if we feed the calves more milk. So we argue very strongly we need to be feeding the calves more milk. But when we do it, that means we need to be more clever about how we wean. And the ways that we used to be able to wean aren't going to work as well. And so, what are some of those clever ways? Well, one of the points that I hinted to in the presentation I gave just now is that we can individualize weaning protocols. That there will be some animals, even when we're feeding lots of milk, that are still really motivated to start eating solid. And those are going to be the easy calves. So those are calves that are essentially going to wean themselves. Those calves, we can, again, if we're using an automatic calf feeder, we can very easily start reducing the milk for those calves. So then they start eating more and more solid feed earlier. But other calves actually just looks like they just need more time on milk in order to thrive. Those calves will also wean. There are no 3-year-old cows in the dairy herd that are living only on milk, right? So just like there's nobody in this audience today that's still going home and breastfeeding from mother, I hope. So we're all weaned, but the way we're weaned, go ask your mother if you have any doubt about this. The way we're weaned is very individual. And we can use some of that good sense that we apply in other systems also in the dairy system. And we can do that much more easily now that we have access to some of this technology as well.
Thank you so much, Dan. I will put on the screen. My colleagues have sent a lot of doubts, a lot of questions. I think you can read it. So first one.
Nice. Okay. Thank you, Mikhail. Interestingly, we're going through this issue very much right now in Canada. Right as of this year, we have a new change in our production standard, our national production standard, which is I'll just take a minute to explain it because it's sort of a cool feature of the Canadian system. Our dairy farmers, and this is part of maybe this very strong part of the value and the psychology of farmers, I think in North America in general. I'm not sure if this is the same in Brazil, but in Canada and the United States, farmers don't want the government to tell them what to do. Probably the most important thing. Anybody can tell them what to do, just not the government. And so they don't want laws to tell them about what to do on farms. And so, but they realize that they also don't just want everybody doing their own random thing, because then that can make their industry look bad. You can have people doing very bad practices, and then that gets on a video, and then everybody thinks, oh no, dairy farming is terrible because there's an example of some very bad practice. An example of that is, for example, people doing disbudding with no pain relief. So there's no reason why people should be doing that. If there's a video of that looks terrible, and all the farmers that are using pain relief, they don't want to be painted with the same brush. So anyways, for those types of reasons, our farmers have basically invented their own law. It's not a true law, but it works within our industry, because it basically they can basically control who is allowed to sell milk. And so our dairy farmers have that as a type of, I mean, you can think of it as a type of cooperative, I guess. But they have created their own code of practice, which basically require things like pain control for disbudding, for example. And that's been happening for a long time now. New this year, there's this requirement that calves are now housed not alone. They can be just in pairs, they can be in larger groups. And that's actually, even though that regulation has come in now, it's only going to be slowly implemented over the next 10 years almost. And the reason for the industry going so slowly for that is they know that there's some resistance or some concern about this. People were worried that there was going to be concern when we created the rule around the pain control. People thought it'd be a problem. It turns out it was no problem. I have never met a farmer that thought that started giving pain control and then stopped doing it because it wasn't effective. Everybody, as soon as they see it, it's like, oh, why have I not always done that? But there are people who are very nervous about the move towards social housing. And it's ironic, again, because the people that are already doing, for example, housing in pairs are very happy with it. But farmers, for good reasons, as I mentioned earlier, there's very high rates of morbidity and mortality in dairy production. And of course, it is possible to control the spread of disease, to control that horizontal and vertical transmission of pathogens by using individual housing. And so there's this idea that is, well, oh my goodness, we have these animals which get sick. How do we help prevent it? Well, we keep them all in individual pens. It turns out that well-managed small groups, and the perfect example of that is pairs, there is no increased risk of disease. There's no evidence of increased risk of disease. However, large groups that are poorly managed can be sources of both vertical and horizontal transmission of pathogens, right? So a poorly managed large group can be a real problem. And so I think this is one of the reasons why I think our industry wants to go sort of slowly with this switch over to group housing, is that there are some farmers that can manage these large groups well. I think almost any farm can manage a pair of calves, two calves together well. But we just need to like a little bit like I showed in that last example of the talk, is we need to basically work with individual farmers to find solutions that work for them. And it's not going to be the same solution for every farmer. Just one last example that comes from that. One of the things which I've never thought about as a problem, because we just really have not had it as an issue in any of our work, is this issue of cross-sucking. So calves sucking on another calf. Of course, when calves are fed individually or housed individually, it's impossible for them to cross-suck. When calves are housed individually and they're limit fed, so given just a few liters of milk and given it by bucket, they show lots of abnormal sucking. So they'll suck on the pen, they'll suck. Probably everybody in this room will know that. They've gone into a calf pen and the calf will come up and start sucking on them. Why is the calf doing it? It's the same thing as why a baby is sucking its thumb. It's actually an abnormal behavior that's related to the lack of a normal substrate for that sucking behavior. So calves that are fed lots of milk and fed milk via a nipple are much less likely to show that abnormal behavior. But again, you could imagine for the farmer who is just unprepared for this, if they use their typical management, they just are feeding the calves let's say just a few liters of milk from a bucket, and then they put a bunch of calves together, that's going to be terrible. Those calves are going to be sucking on one another. They're going to be competing for milk. It's going to be terrible. So it's not. And this is again, like I said to Stella, dairying is complicated, right? If you want a simple job, don't be a dairy farmer. But yeah, can we manage small groups of calves? Well, of course we can, but we need to get the milk feeding right. We need to use the right type of, not just the right amount of milk, but the right way of feeding the milk. We need to be controlling our disease in general. If we have a case where our farm is a disaster and we have very high levels of mortality, there's bigger problems on that farm than social housing. So I think there's lots of progress we can make, Mikhail, and sorry for a long answer there, but you can see it's something I'm very passionate about, and it's very important right now in Canada.
So then the next question is divided in two. So I'll show the first part, then the next one, okay?
Okay, so thank you, Isabella. In terms of euthanasia, interestingly, I actually have done lots of work on euthanasia, but almost all of my work on euthanasia has been on laboratory animals, has been on rats and mice. And this will seem strange maybe for you, thinking of me as just mostly as a dairy researcher, but I'm not just a dairy researcher. We have this wonderful farm with our dairy cows, and I'm very passionate about improving the lives of those animals. But here on the campus, our main campus for the University of British Columbia, we use almost 200,000 laboratory animals a year. So there's many, many animals that live here all around me on the campus. And so over my career, I've also tried to work to try to help those animals. And the most common procedure that every one of those animals experiences is euthanasia. And so I've done work trying to improve euthanasia for those animals. It's a really important topic. It's actually a very difficult topic to work on because it's this issue of killing animals, and I think it relates actually also to the work on dairy, and why I also wanted to talk a little bit in this talk about positive welfare, because I think sometimes when we're working on welfare, all we're talking about is the negative stuff, and I know it's very hard on our students to always be thinking about the negative stuff. So it's nice to also be working on positive aspects, and I must say, it's something I love about working on with the cows, with the dairy cattle, is I think there's lots of really positive things that happen on dairy farms and the lives of our dairy cattle. It's not just negative things. But when we are doing something negative, like killing the animal, it's really important that we do it well. So I think it's important that we do research on that, and that we help farmers again be selecting the best methods. I'll give you one example of some research that we did on that, which I think is which really struck me and I've been affected by. Is one of the things we found. We're looking at farmers' willingness to euthanize their cows after the animals had been down for a period of time. And what we found is that many of the farmers were just they always felt that the cow would, the next day the cow would be better. And they had this idea, we call them sort of this belief in these Lazarus cows, these cows that were going to rise again. And it's a lovely idea. And I actually see the same thing for my friends with an old dog. And they'll have this dog is really old, the dog should be euthanized. But they're saying, oh, no, I can't say goodbye to my dog. I love it too much. It's like, okay, I'm glad you love your dog. But for me as a welfare person, I want you to make a good decision. And I see for those individuals, for example, I think the same thing applies with farmers, how difficult it is in the moment to make a decision, because you always think the next day the dog's going to be better. And the farmer thinks the next day the animal's going to be better. Coming back to the lab animals, we actually have a really good way of solving that. If you're going to do an experiment with laboratory animals, when you apply for permission to do that, you have to specify your humane endpoints. You have to say, once the animal has lost 5% of body weight, once the animal has shown 24 hours of not standing, for example, the animal will be euthanized. And you say that beforehand, before you have the animal in front of you, and that makes the decision. It's much less likely that you're going to do this thing of, oh, just give it another day, which will work very rarely, but most of the time means the animal experiences this period of prolonged suffering. So that's one of the innovations that we've been trying to work with farmers, is to get them to come up with their defined endpoints. Which often, for example, with down cows means that after 24 hours, that animal should be euthanized. The chance of that animal actually really recovering after 24 hours is very, very low. And the chance of prolonged suffering is very high. So there's, I don't know if that helps, but there's one example that we've been thinking about.
Okay, thank you very much then. Do we have more questions? Oh, one more. João Freire.
João, are you saying in terms of milk production, how much milk the cow is producing, or are you saying the amount of liters a calf will drink? Because that's what I was talking about in my in my presentation.
I think João is asking about the production.
Okay, of cows, cool. So, there's lots of debate about this, João. If you go into our farm, and Tiago will remember this, on the wall, we've got all these trophies for the highest production here and the highest production this, and that's because, of course, and I'm sure there's the same thing in some farms in Brazil, where you go, there's this idea from dairy farming is the best cows are the ones that produce the best milk, the most amount of milk. At least I'm starting to think that's not a great way of thinking about dairying, partly because of all the problems that we get associated with high production. Of course, as we all know, high rates of mastitis, also high rates of lameness, other types of production diseases. And I think we're often managing our cows for higher levels of production than makes sense in terms of animal welfare. I think we're also sometimes managing our cows for higher levels of production than makes sense environmentally too, because it requires feeding the cows high amounts of grain, for example. So yeah, what is that average? But to answer your question, the average in terms of liters would be about more than 10,000 of liters per milk per lactation, 10 or 11 or 12 even. So let's say about 40 kilograms per day. Many farms doing much more than that. But as I said, for our own farm, personally, I'm trying to encourage that we try to achieve just a somewhat lower level of production. So instead of, it sounds odd to say, but I would like to see many fewer trophies for highest level of production and more trophies for lowest rates of mastitis and lowest rates of lameness.
Yeah, thank you very much then. Yeah, I believe João is asking this just to have an idea about the reality, right, in Canada and how it is.
And Tiago and João, where that question comes from, of course, too, and I understand that as well. So in our highly intensive situation, our indoor context, we're feeding lots of grain.
Yeah.
We're feeding our own forages, locally harvested, but our grain all comes from Alberta. It all comes from hundreds, if not 1,000 kilometers away. But the high level of grain allows us to achieve the high levels of production. And so the farmers are in that situation. Do we feed local ingredients and that way have a more sustainable production, or do we up our production by feeding more grain? And our system makes it very easy to feed lots of grain and to achieve these high levels of production. But it's not clear whether these are good for cows, and it's not clear even whether these are good economically, and it's not good whether they're good for the environment. So there's lots of questions which I think we need to be working on still as dairy scientists.
Yes. I agree with you, and we can see a change in the dairy industry. For example, when you are looking for bulls, right, to use in your cows, a few years ago, probably we were just looking at the milk yield, right? Now the life expectation, it's much more important, right? And lots of farmers are looking for this more healthier animals, right? Yeah. Please, Stella, next question.
So, thank you for your question. It's interestingly, people who sell, we just, my colleague Marina von Kazink and I just did another review paper on technology in what's sometimes referred to as precision agriculture. Often the people who write those articles, the people who sort of seem to be selling the technology, will talk about welfare benefits associated with the technology. It's not clear that those benefits really are true, that the technologies normally for the equipment as it's sold actually provides benefits. And it's not clear why the farmers are buying it. So is it that the farmers are buying the technology so as to improve the cow's welfare? It's probably part of it. It's probably complicated. One of the most common forms of technology, as I said earlier, that we see on our farms are these automatic milking systems. I think those are mostly about improving the farmer's welfare. But they're also, I think the farmers want them to work well for the cows, so it's together. Another very important form of technology, of sensor technology we see on farms, is to use for heat detection, for estrus detection. That really isn't so much about the cow's welfare. It's just really to make sure the cows are pregnant, which is good for the farmers and farm economics. But yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities to use these better. And I think, for farmers, of course, they want their animals to be healthy. They want their animals to be productive. So there are good ways of making sure that we're using this equipment to improve the welfare in ways that also are going to improve the farmer welfare. And I think that's what we need to be looking at with the technology.
Then the next question is also divided in two. So I'll put first part, then the next one, okay?
Sure. Huh. Cool. That's a super cool question. The issue of when to group. So this is if you're going to group animals, when is that social contact important? And you probably know this literature better than I do, Mikhail, but but my belief is that at least for the first few days of life, it probably doesn't matter to calves that they're socially housed. And one of the reasons I believe this is that in the natural rearing system for cattle, if you just have wild or really extensively reared cattle, these are a hider species. So the cow will put the calf off somewhere, will often calf excluded from the rest of the herd. She'll leave her calf there, and then she'll go off and forage, and then she'll come back to the calf. And then a few days later, she'll bring that calf. The calf will follow her back to the rest of the herd. So I think the calves, at least in the first few days of life, probably aren't that motivated to be with other calves, and it probably doesn't matter that much to them. But exactly when it is important to them is a matter of some debate. And I think it is important at some point. My own preference is to pair soon, like as you've written there, at about 7 days of age. I think that's about right. Why not? But I think if somebody was to pair at 2 weeks of age, that's okay, or 10 days too. I don't think it probably matters. But I think 8 weeks is too late. So, but I think it's one of these areas where just more research needs to be done. Whether they're anhedonic or not I don't know if that's the case, but I think that understanding the consequences of this sort of social isolation is really important, because I think that does helps motivate us as researchers, hopefully motivates us as people who are working with dairy farmers to show how important the social housing is. It's not just, oh, that would be nice. It's really important. And, this is funny. We, of course, we're all victims of our own culture, right? We're all victims of this little world that we live in. And in dairy, we're so used to this idea that calves are just by themselves. There is no other mammalian species for which you do this, right? In fact, these are these very famous, infamous early experiments in psychology where they reared primates individually caused these terrible effects. And we know this for human influence. This individual rearing is one of the most profoundly negative things. We know it for rodents. We know it for all mammals where it's been tested. Keeping animals individually has a profound negative experience on the animals. But this is routine for us in dairy. So of course it's not surprising that it is going to be profoundly negative for the animals, and we need to find ways of avoiding it. But it's also, as we talked about in the previous question, I think our challenges now is really finding ways of helping farmers implement solutions that work for them, and that those solutions are probably just going to look different for different farmers. I think where we need to be motivated is just that we can't accept just not pairing as the appropriate solution. We need to do some kind of social housing, but it might look very different on different farms, and that's okay.
All right, thank you.
That
Then
is all.
that's
the
all questions. Okay.
Yes.
I have one question then, by just research interest. And how did you perform the pessimism score in that research that you provide the sugar solution for the calves?
So you can imagine in the first study that I showed you of cognitive bias testing, where we showed the pink screens, you can imagine you have animals that 100% of the time when you show them the pink screen, they treat that like it's negative. They never approach. Those would be the most pessimistic. And then you have animals which, when you show them pink, they run up and they start as if they're going to get the bottle straight away. Those are the most optimistic. And so it's simply ranking the animals in terms of the percentage of time that they would approach the pink screen would be a way of thinking about it. Now, the way Ben did the test in his actual specific setup is he was doing basically a spatial cognitive bias task, not a color task. So it was the far most left versus the far most right, but it's the same kind of idea. They were treating the intermediate stimuli as more negative. But this is before disbudding. So this is just animals. Ben was trying to do a type of personality testing. So he's just saying, what is the calf's personality? And what he's found is that there's some calves that are really much more negative and some calves that are much more positive. What was interesting in terms of the result I showed you is the calves that are already pessimistic, the calves that already think the glass is half empty, when they experience pain, they're more likely then to show this anhedonia response. One important implication of that is I think we need to be thinking about, well, why do we have these pessimistic calves? And maybe it's just personality. We know that, like in your classroom, in our own family, we know people that are more optimistic and more pessimistic. But we also know, both in people and in animals, this is not just something you're born with. We learn to be more pessimistic and optimistic because we have more lucky and less lucky lives. So I've had an amazingly lucky life, and I'm like a crazy optimist. Everything, I always think the world is going to be glass half empty, but I know it's not by chance. It's because I've been super lucky. So of course I'm going to expect things are going to be lucky, right? It's like I'm a privileged person. I'm at a great university. I've had good parents. I went to good schools, all these sort of privileges that probably almost everybody in this room today, it's the same thing. We come from these very privileged consequences. So good things have happened to us, mostly. Some bad things too, of course, but mostly good things. And so, but then, okay, if we think about that for, let's say, our young calves, what is the impact of a calf that, let's say, expects every time they see us that we're going to disbud them, or we're going to give them an injection, or we're going to restrain them, or maybe even worse, on the worst farms, we're going to kick them or whatever, right? So how optimistic is that calf, right? And these are all things we can control. And so, we've done all these bad, think of all the bad things. We've done all these bad things to the calf. Now this means the calf, even if we do something totally normal, a stranger walks in that does nothing to it, the calf treats that as being highly fearful. The animal has this fear response. It runs away and it bangs into the side of the wall. Then the person goes up and they just try to pet the calf. They're doing something totally natural, neutral. But for the calf, it's like the worst thing that could possibly happen to it, that the person's trying to pet it, right? So now we've created this world for the calf where even good things are actually perceived as bad. And so if that's the case, to me, that really should make us think about the profound importance of trying to create not a history of good experiences for the animals we work with. And it's why it's so important to be, that we hire good employees on farms, that we most of all hire employees that are never going to be cruel, but farmers that are thinking about ways of every time they go in, how can I make sure this is a positive experience for the animal? Maybe giving a little treat, maybe these kinds of things, just simple things that you see good farmers do, right? These are things good farmers know already. But maybe us as animal scientists, as people who work as dairy scientists, haven't thought about this enough and haven't talked about it enough in terms of trying to change the culture on farms.
Okay, and one last thing that I'd like to discuss with you is one of the first topics that you showed us today. It's about this transition for the herd to the individual, right? And as a teacher in veterinary science, what we teach is that, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago, it happens the opposite way, right?
Exactly.
The herds were very small, very individual. The veterinarians would go there just to treat one animal and then take their car and go home, right? And then we go to the preventive veterinary medicine and treat the herd and not the individual. But now and the herd gets so big that sometimes it's very, very difficult, right, to monitor and to know each individual animal in the herd. And but with the technology, the things are changing again, and now we have the opportunity to see each animal individually. And it's also interesting to see the words that the farmers point out, like in the future, what they would like to see.
Yeah.
I think it goes in that direction also. And but I'd just like you to say a little more about this. You present the example of the weaning calves and the start intake and all that. But if you have more examples about this and how you see this changing in the dairy industry.
Yeah, maybe 2 points to that. One is that, yeah, I mean, what I'm not saying is that what we need is an individual veterinarian to do an individual exam of each animal. These things which aren't realistic. However, imagine we have this. Not imagine. The reality is that more and more we've got lots of sensors on farms. And so what we could do is begin to at least identify different types of strategies that work for different types of animals. That might not mean that we know how to, that we're coming up with something that's completely specific for one individual, but it could be, let's say, instead of having one weaning program, we have 2 weaning programs, or maybe we have 10 weaning programs, doesn't matter. But the idea is we just try to be smarter, try to use the data to fit the program to the animal. And I think there's lots of opportunities to do that in terms of these more welfare-related issues. But let me give you another issue, which I think is also really important from the perspective of veterinary medicine, and a really important practical and ethical issue we have around antibiotic resistance, and that is dry cow therapy. So, it was not long ago we would encourage all farmers to, give antibiotics to every cow at the beginning, at dry off. Now we know it's not even helpful. It's not even a good idea. We can use data that we have to identify which animals would really benefit from that. And so that's selective dry cow therapy. That's using the data we have to make better decisions. And, that's going to save farmers money. It's going to improve the reputation of dairy farming. It's going to allow dairy farming to be more sustainable. It's going to, all these things that we want, right? So I absolutely think that's the future, that automation allows us to make better decisions. And that means what we, before, in the period that you described, Tiago, we didn't have a choice because it was too difficult. We didn't know which animals would benefit. So we just said, okay, we'll do a blanket treatment. We don't have to do that anymore. We can be smarter than that.
All right. Yeah. In my perspective, I don't believe we're going to come back to that individual veterinary treatment, right? But I believe this is also necessary. Sometimes vets forget about this individual cow, and also that this individual is part of the herd and represent the herd.
Yes.
So you need to have diagnosis and the right diagnosis, right? And I see this as an opportunity to individualize the cows. For example, in the transition period, some papers have shown that, for example, anti-inflammatory drugs, it's not all cows that benefit from anti-inflammatory drugs during the transition period, but the cows that are more prone to develop cetosis or mastitis or anything like this just after the labor. It should be an opportunity to give them anti-inflammatory, but for now it's how we separate the ones that will be beneficial and the others that will not, right? Okay, then I think that's all for now and for today. I thank you once again very much for your time and your availability. And I hope we will have more opportunities like that. And I believe our students and all the audience have like very much and have enjoy very much your lecture. So I end here with a big thanks to you and all your colleagues, also the students and other professors from the animal welfare.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure meeting all of you, and great to see you again, Tiago. Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope to be able to come in person sometime and do this again.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much, then.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye bye, Dad.